Hi everyone. So today let's take a look at Alexa Schriempf's essay, Refusing the Amputated Body. There are a lot of moving parts in this text, and I want to touch on some of the salient points, the main points that Schriempf is making here, to be sure that we have a general understanding of Schriempf's argument and how it relates to the other readings that we've been looking at throughout the course. So, in this text, Schriempf is arguing that feminism and disability studies do not currently have the resources to address disabled women's issues, and an interactionist approach can provide these resources. So Schriempf spends a good amount of time in the first 2/3 of her essay explaining current approaches, including the social model and the medical model, and explaining why these models are problematic. And she also weaves in the accounts of experiences of two disabled women, Ellen Stoll and the woman with spina bifida who asks her doctor if she can have satisfying sex. So what we'll do in this video is discuss the approaches that Schriempf argues not only fall short, but amputate the body from the social and the material aspects of disabled women's lives. And then we'll discuss her proposed approach, which is an interactionist approach based on some work that Nancy Tawana did. So Schriempf critiques both brute social constructivist approaches and brute materialist approaches in this text. And the primary critique against brute constructivist approaches and social models of disability as well as feminist approaches fall under this brute constructivism. And she finds these problematic because brute constructivist approaches amputate the body from the materiality of the lives of disabled women. And on the other side, she finds that brute materialist accounts amputate the body from the social aspects of disabled women's lives. So accounts that are strictly constructivist on the one hand and strictly materialist on the other hand are going to be problematic. So first she discusses the medical model, which is a model that is dominant in disability studies. And the medical model focuses on impairment as a bodily lack or deviance from a normal or ideal body type. And it approaches impairment and disability in such a way that bodies that are impaired need to be cured or healed. And so this approach, in addition to being problematic because it amputates the body from the social, is problematic because it puts authority over the body in the hands of the institution of medicine. And if we think back to Fausto Sterling's piece, we should already have an idea of why this might be problematic, of putting the control of people's bodies in the hands of those who take a medical approach to curing certain kinds of bodies. And Schriempf argues that this is oppressive to the body, to the mind, and to the spirit. And when the body is amputated from the social, it needs to be refused. So we need to refuse the amputation, and we need to refuse the body to the social. And she discusses the disabled woman with spina bifida who asks her doctor about whether or not she can have satisfying sexual relations with a man. And from the medical model approach, this woman is seen merely as an impaired woman whose impairment does not prevent her from providing sex to a man. Her doctor tells her that despite her impairment, he sees nothing wrong with a man having sex with her in a satisfying way. So she's seen as sexually objectified as merely a functioning receptacle for intercourse with a man. And this is problematic because on this medical model, again, the woman with spina bifida is seen merely as a body, as an impaired body, a material body that is amputated from her social needs. And so we need to refuse, put back together the social with the material body that is seen strictly as impaired, deviant, or non-ideal. On the other hand, she discusses the social model. And we find the social model not only in disability studies, but also largely in feminism. We discussed this in response to Garland Thompson's essay, and Ogiemi touches on these issues as well. The social model locates disability strictly in society, failing to attend to the body or impairment. So on this model, discrimination of disabled women is wholly a consequence of social oppression. The attitudes and social practices of other people. So on the social model, liberatory theories are focused on the fact that we need to change people's attitudes in order to eliminate the oppression of women with disabilities. But on this approach, the social model, women's bodies are amputated from their specific biological needs. If we're only looking at the social in terms of people's attitudes as a cause for the disabling of women with disabilities, then these women's bodies are amputated from their specific biological needs. And so if we look again at the woman with spina bifida who asks her doctor about satisfying sexual relations with a man, we can see that her body is amputated from her biological needs in the sense that the doctor does not see her as having any sexual agency or desires, and from a disability standpoint, we can't really see anything wrong with his attitude towards her, although from a feminist perspective we can say that he sexually objectifies her, seeing her simply as a receptacle for intercourse with a man. But from a disability standpoint, there doesn't seem to be any social attitude that's problematic about his response. So her biological needs are not taken into consideration here. But we can't see this because we're only concerned with social attitudes and practices. Now, in addition to both the brute constructivist and brute materialist accounts, so the social model and the medical model or biological model, there have been some theorists who have proposed additive approaches that ask us to look at both the social and the material. However, as Schriempf argues, these additive approaches are problematic in much the same way that both Spellman and Crenshaw argued that additive or stacked approaches to race and gender are problematic. Additive approaches to women's disability are problematic because they are also based on a kind of biological foundationalism that dichotomizes not only sex and gender, but also impairment and disability. And so in the same way that Black women are left out of top-down theories about gender oppression and racial oppression, women with disabilities are left out of top-down theories about gender oppression and oppression of people with disabilities. So this kind of biological foundationalism found in these dichotomizing top-down approaches are problematic because the dichotomization of sex and gender as biological and social, and impairment and disability as biological and social, is both inaccurate and harmful in terms of representing gender and disability identities. And further, it prevents a bridge between disability studies and feminism by amputating the body from the social on the one hand and amputating the body from the material on the other hand, and thus amputating the material from the social. So because of the problematic nature of approaches that dichotomize and rely on a kind of biological foundationalism, Schriempf is arguing that we need a different kind of approach in order to both build a bridge between feminist theory and disability studies, as well as in order to accurately represent women with disabilities and undermine the oppression of women with disabilities. And for Schriempf, an interactionist model is just the thing we can look to as a resource. So again, in the same way that women of color don't simply experience double oppression, gender oppression and racial oppression, women with disabilities don't simply experience double oppression, gender oppression and disability oppression. Using the interactionist approach to build a bridge between feminist theory and disability theory can enable us to take responsibility for understanding how bodies are formed in, created by, and acted upon by a society while also acting within and impacting a society. So there's an agency given both to social attitudes and practices, like on the social model, but there's also an agency given to the body and how it is interacting and impacting society. So for Schriempf, interactionism gives us a new way of thinking about bodies that departs from biological foundationalism and views our bodies as locations for meaning and knowing. So we have to acknowledge that bodies are both weak and powerful. They can be the site of both impairment and agency. Interaction is founded on the principle that everything is already both social and material. Bodies are not pre-social, and social practices are not separable from materiality. So there's a kind of metaphysics at play here, very similar to the metaphysics at play in Garland Thompson's piece, that relies on a more relational or interactive understanding of materiality and sociality. So the lines between binarisms like sex and gender and impairment and disability become blurred. There is no strict dichotomy that separates biological sex from social gender. There is no strict dichotomy that separates biological impairment from social disability. Bodies are fluid and plastic. They defy boundaries between the social and the material. Thus, binarisms should be both refused and refused, fused back together. So viewing bodies and culture as inherently interactive requires us to reject what Schriempf is calling an object metaphysics and replace it with a process metaphysics. So an object metaphysics sees things as static and having inherent qualities, whereas a process metaphysic looks at phenomena and interaction rather than the relation of static objects like sex over here and gender over here, impairment over here and disability over here. A process metaphysics looks at phenomena or experiences and can account for the interaction of the material and social within a given phenomena. So impairment, like sex, is not a fact about the body that is acted on by the social. If this were the case, it would be impossible to challenge the claim that impairment is internally fixed as deviance from some norm of able-bodiedness. Impairment can't be factual, but it also can't be meaningless. To say that impairment is a biological fact is to say that it will always be already disabling, both physically and culturally. An impaired body will be always amputated from the social. So trying to cut off an impaired body from the social is a way of ensuring that impaired bodies are always seen as already factually deviant or lacking. But an interactionist view refuses the social with the material and shows how impairment is not merely a fact about bodies, but impaired bodies are already shot through with social values. Seeing impairment as a lack is not merely a fact about bodies, but it's a contingent fact about socially constructed bodies. So for this reason, Schriempf is arguing that impairment and disability must be refused as interactional, having no clear line between them. Impairment is not strictly biological, and disability is not strictly social. Impairment is always already a part of the social and material realms, and disability is always already inclusive of social norms and attitudes about bodies, as well as material bodies and how those bodies are shaped. Further, impairment and disability are both historically and materially contingent, and they're about the material and social conditions of one's body, as well as the social and material conditions of one's environment. So we can make distinctions about body and culture, about nature and society, about gender and sex, about impairment and disability, but we should not make the distinctions dichotomous, and we should take responsibility for the impact of the distinctions we do make. So we have to be aware that these alleged binaries are actually interactive. So for example, if someone were to argue that male and female genitals just are the sites of erotic pleasure, that that's a material fact, one would be relying on an object metaphysics which dichotomizes the social and the material. Yet, that genitals provide erotic pleasure is not merely a material fact amputated from social values. That genitals provide sexual pleasure is shaped by our concepts, our social concepts of eroticism. The physicality of sexual pleasure is shaped by social discourses, and social discourses are shaped by physical responses. So there's always an interactionism among the social and the material. They cannot be easily separated. And thus biological foundationalist approaches that dichotomize the social and the material fail to acknowledge the ways in which the material interacts with the social and the social interacts with the material always already. So discrimination against women with disabilities can't be solved by distinguishing between impairment and disability, but by understanding the ways in which impairment and disability interact to enable sexist, ableist, heterosexist, classist, racist, and ageist biases. So what interactionism does is it demands that we assume epistemic responsibility for the categories by which we live. And these categories are always already both biological and social. And this allows us to always be examining and re-examining, evaluating and re-evaluating our thinking and our embodiment as we navigate through the world.